Good morning, y'all. Welcome to the final day of Roadmap. My name is Gina Avalos-Lamardo, and I'm the Associate Director at Fourth. We have a lot of great things in store for y'all today, so I will get to it shortly, but I have a few quick reminders first. First up, if you haven't downloaded our conference app, Whova, it's a great way to enhance your experience, so be sure to do that. Also, a friendly reminder that masks are recommended and encouraged. If you need one, you can stop by the registration table and they'll have one for you. And then lastly, thank you all for being here. And another thank you so much to all our sponsors for their support. Okay, it is now my pleasure to welcome our Mobility for All sponsors to the stage. These sponsors support our Mobility for All scholarships, which support the travel and attendance of folks at community-based organizations doing work at the intersection of racial equity and transportation electrification. You will hear a few minutes from each one of them, with an exception of Rebecca Fisher, the Drive Electric Campaign Director at ClimateWorks, who cannot be here today. So first up, I would like to introduce Max Pike, Manager, TNC and Fleet Business Development from Electrify America.
Thanks, everybody. So as was mentioned, I'm Max Pike, and I'm really excited to be here today representing Electrify America as a proud sponsor of this pivotal conference at the forefront of the electric mobility revolution. As the manager for Fleet and Transportation Network Company Business Development at Electrify America, I'm part of a team that's providing access to our charging infrastructure and the business services that'll help make the transition to an electric transportation future a seamless one. We're committed to investing $2 billion over 10 years in zero-emission vehicle infrastructure, education, and access, and to help make that happen, beyond expanding the nation's largest open ultra-fast charging network in the U.S., we're providing innovative solutions for home, workplace, and public charging. Electrify America is working very hard to educate consumers, businesses, and beyond about the benefits of an EV lifestyle. This is what makes the Mobility for All scholarships aligned so strongly with Electrify America's values and our mission. Over the past few years, we have made and continue to make significant investments in community-based organizations across the country to support brand-neutral, zero-emission vehicle education and awareness programs, STEM education, and workforce development training. We found that partnering with trusted organizations embedded in the fabric of their communities with clear and creative plans has proven very successful in reaching and engaging those that are often overlooked in the electric vehicle conversation. We're honored to play a small but important part in this work through our sponsorship of the Fourth Roadmap Conference and the work we continue to be involved in with all these organizations. Our planned investments will help enable a tidal wave of Americans to discover the benefits of driving electric. We expect to have more than 1,800 total charging stations with over 10,000 chargers in the United States and Canada by 2026. Additionally, we've invested to ensure our network is backed by 100% renewable energy, meaning that when you charge with Electrify America, your energy carbon footprint will be net zero. The electric future has to belong to all of us, or it can't belong to any of us. Tackling some of the biggest challenges we face, from climate change to equity and diversity in our communities and around the world, requires an all-of-the-above approach. We'll continue to do the work alongside all of you to be a part of the roadmap that charts the course for the future we're all striving for. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. Up next, we have Kate Hawley, Electric Vehicle Senior Product Manager from Pacific Power.
Morning. So wonderful to be here. As you know, my name is Kate Hawley. I'm the Senior Electric Vehicle Product Manager for Pacific Power. We're so excited to be a big part of bringing EVs to customers across the 3 states we operate in. And we've been supporting this work for years and years. And we're really excited to see how interest is growing, especially in our territories, which are considered mostly rural. So ensuring equitable access is a key objective of our work in transportation electrification. And Pacific Power, as I mentioned, mostly serves rural customers throughout Northern California, Oregon, and Southeast Washington. And a majority of those customers are and would be categorized as underserved. So that is why becoming a Mobility for All sponsor is particularly important to us at Pacific Power, and that we really wanted to become this kind of part of this conference. So we believe this scholarship has enabled people throughout our service area, as well as elsewhere, to really become a part of this amazing conference. So I just wanted to speak real briefly to some of the work we're doing to support transportation electrification in our territory. We've expanded our offerings in Oregon for our mobility grants. So we have a robust set of grant opportunities out there for our communities to take advantage of. And on June 1st, we launched a rebate program for level 2 chargers, residential, commercial, and multifamily. And 2023 is going to be lightning. We are moving real quick. We are putting our transportation electrification plan before the commission in Oregon. We've got one in Washington. Things are expanding. We're looking for great people to join our team, so let me know if you're interested. And just to let you know, our mobility grants to date have funded pretty innovative projects. So e-tractors in Crook County, which is Central Oregon where I'm from. We have an electric bike share initiative in Corvallis, and a number of different bus programs in Bend Lapine School District here in Public Portland Schools. And we also have installed about 37 charging stations throughout the state of Oregon for our infrastructure grants, and are starting to even do a lot of that work up in our territory in Washington. So just want to really be thankful to Forth. Forth is a partner of ours that goes beyond the conference. They're supporting us in a lot of our community outreach throughout our 3 states. They host a lot of our events, and I'm just so thankful for this sponsorship or partnership. So truly, it's been an opportunity to be a part of this here at this conference and bringing mobility to all our customers.
Thank you both so much for the great work you're doing. Up next, we have a sponsor intro for our plenary panel. Please welcome Alex Scott, Business Development Vice President from Clear Result, to do the intro for this session.
Good morning, and thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. A little bit about Clear Result. So over the last 40 years, Clear Result has been working to achieve our mission across North America through the work of more than 2,500 consultants in changing the way that people use energy. For the most part, that expression has come through the implementation of energy efficiency programs on the behalf of utilities, but certainly over the last 10 years or so, we started to transition that mission and express that through looking at distributed energy resources, demand response, and certainly electric vehicles. Today I'm joined by a couple of colleagues who you may know or see around in the audience, Peter Ye, Varun Thakar, and Panesh Parea. Each of those gentlemen have been working over the last couple of years with electric vehicles, advancing charging infrastructure with a strong focus on working in advancing infrastructure in disadvantaged communities, working with fleets and ensuring that we're getting both kind of the right considerations for installing infrastructure and the transition from kind of regular ICE cars to electric vehicles, and also just working with education and working with dealerships on letting folks know why they should purchase an electric vehicle, and working to facilitate incentives that are provided for customers for the purchase of new and used electric vehicles. We've been able to kind of continue that expression of changing the way people use energy through a recent acquisition that Clear Result had made through a company called Choose EV. And over the last several years, Choose EV has been working mostly with utility customers and educating them and their customers about all the considerations that you need to have in the purchase of an electric vehicle. So all of those things aside, I'm very pleased to welcome the panel that's going to be speaking today. And from a personal perspective, my education background, I have a bachelor's in English literature, I have a master's degree in city and metropolitan planning. So I've always been fascinated with the intersection of people, place, and technology, and how that has changed so dramatically and continues to change at a rapid pace year over year. So with that, please allow me to introduce first our moderator for the panel, Roland Hwang, who is the Director of Climate and Clean Energy Program at the Heising-Simons Foundation, Harriet Tregoning, who is the Director of the New Urban Mobility Alliance, Monique López, the founder and social justice planner for Pueblo Planning, and finally, Eric Myers, the executive director for CharIN North America. Thank you.
Let's see if this works. So, first of all, I am obviously not Roland. I apologize for that. He is smarter and better looking than I am, and he works at a foundation, so those folks are always smarter and better looking. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us here today, so I'm going to pinch hit and moderate this panel. But I'm very excited to do that. You know, basically the premise of this panel is that, you may not be aware of this, but for the past decade or so, as a lot of people in this room have been working to electrify everything that moves, and especially electrify cars, there have been a lot of other smart, passionate people at conferences like this who've been working for several decades to make us all a lot less dependent on those cars and to make it easier to get around without depending on a privately owned automobile. And I spent a decade or so in that world myself before transitioning over to this. And yet it's always struck me that we're kind of moving in parallel. So it's excited to bring those worlds together here. With that said, and just reading what was on the text, let me do a quick poll. This is a low-tech poll of the audience. So how many folks coming in here would say you think it's most important to electrify vehicles? The next, yep. Okay. How many people, this is a trick question, would say it's most important to have compact cities that are less reliant on private cars? Okay. It's more mixed than I thought. And how many people think we need to do both? Okay, you read the program. That's good. No, but it's good to know where folks are coming from. And just to set it up a little bit, a couple of statistics before we get into the panel. So we know that part of what inspired this panel was a report that came out recently from the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, which is a longtime global advocate for bicycles and for more human-centered urban forms, that concluded, this report, as have many others before it, that to meet our carbon goals, to have any hope of meeting our carbon goals, we need to dramatically reduce the amount of driving we're doing, the number of vehicle miles traveled, and we need to electrify everything that moves. And about half the reductions to get us to our goal would come from each of those two measures, basically. And yet, most of the coverage I saw of that report, the headline was, EVs won't save us, or some variant to that. It was not compact cities won't save us, it was not we need to do both. And that really got me thinking that we have a communications problem between these worlds. We also know from an equity standpoint that transportation is the second highest household expense, and that was true before $6 a gallon gasoline. We know that commute time is the biggest predictor of whether a family can get out of poverty. We know that 90% of Americans own cars. Most trips are made by car. Even among lowest income Americans, most trips are made by car. So, I mean, basically, in a lot of America today, being able to own or operate a car is kind of a minimum price of admission to the modern economy. And we also know, I don't think I have to repeat here, all the harm that has done in our cities, punching highways through neighborhoods, destroying communities, polluting the air, et cetera. So it's pretty clear we need to do both, right? We need to electrify our cars, and we need to be a lot less dependent on them. And yet, this is where our state of discussion is. So we have a great panel here to talk about how do we work together to do both of those things. And where are they actually in conflict, if anywhere, and where can we align ourselves and move in the same direction? So We already had the panel introduced. Harriet Tregoning, Director of the New Urban Mobility Alliance, Monique López with Pueblo Planning, and Erika Myers with CharIN North America. And I should out you as a fourth board member as well, I think. So we're going to give each of these panelists a chance, first of all, just make a short opening statement, share a little bit about themselves and their work, and kind of their initial take on these issues, and then we'll popcorn some questions. So I think we agreed, Harriet, you were going to go first.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. A little bit more about myself. I'm a civil engineer who's worked at the federal, the state, and the local level, and for much of the last 20 years, I've worked for mayors, governors, and the president, running agencies or departments that do planning, policy, and implementation at the intersection of land use, transportation, housing, environmental quality, health, and equity. Of course, I'm going to say unequivocally that we need both, but that merely doing both is going to be pitifully inadequate. I would never say there's too much focus on EVs. What I might say is that there's too much focus on urgency. That when we use the term urgency and when we work to heighten the sense of urgency, to, I know why you do this, to encourage people to act, right? If it's not urgent, people might act later, and it might be too late. And I know that asking people to act is more effective when it's specific and narrow and simple. Urgency has become how we justify why we can't spend the time to address complex problems with the deliberateness, the collaboration, the creativity, and the time needed to come up with multifaceted solutions. My experience is that in most of our communities, we don't just have a transportation decarbonization problem. We have a transportation access problem. We have a transportation safety problem. We have a transportation affordability problem. We have a transportation pollution problem. In many communities, we also have a housing insecurity. We have food insecurity. We have unemployment or underemployment. We have a legacy of discrimination and racial injustice, and we have growing vulnerability to extreme weather and the associated interruptions in utility service. In the face of these issues, a lot of community members feel urgency, but climate change and decarbonization often come near the end of a very long list. I think that there's a world where we all work to continue to address transportation decarbonization problems and successfully meet the coming milestones to electrify, especially passenger vehicles. But there's a world where we do that without ever making any dent at all in the problems many communities feel is really urgent, or actually deepening those problems. So maybe this debate between do we do compact cities or do we do electrification of vehicles is really kind of a proxy for saying, do we engage in the messy, complicated engagements and do we discipline ourselves to ask the question in everything that we're all doing? Is there a way to do it in a way that increases the equity? Is there a way to better understand how these policies we're advocating, these projects we're promoting, how they land in communities and how they, what's the distribution of their benefits and harms? And are there ways that we can try to meet our goals, but also do it so that we reduce the inequity and we get more benefits to communities and try to do these things together? I heard in the many wonderful sessions at Fourth, there have been some terrific conversations around equity. And in one panel yesterday that I sat in on, someone said, we can walk and chew gum, right? And I think that's what we're talking about. Let's embrace the messiness of this, and let's, really try to tackle, the range of problems that so many of our communities face.
Great, I love it. Yeah, Monique, what do you think?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this beautiful city of Portland. At Pueblo Planning, we're a participatory planning and design firm that intentionally engages communities that can be most impacted from any planning process, any policy decision, any design decision. And quite typically, and quite frankly, these are Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with low wealth households, the unhoused, maybe folks on fixed incomes. And we always try to center their voices in the conversation. So that's what I hope to do today in the conversation with you all as well. So the question, right, electric vehicles, compact cities, or both? I definitely agree with Harriet. We need both, but both is not enough. If we just do these two things, the same people are going to be left out of the benefits, and the same people are going to bear the burden of this transition. And so with that, I think what we have is a fundamental debate on what is more innovative. Folks on one side of the conversation may say, well, electric vehicles, that's the future, that's where innovation is headed. Others on the debate of the compact cities say, well, that's the future, that's the most innovative thing to do. But those two things on its own, or those two things together on its own, I would say it's not innovative. That may be a very controversial statement. And the reason why it's not innovative, it's because it's following, with those two things on its own, it's following the same destructive, extractive patterns as previous things that in the transportation sector that were labeled innovative. A few years back, I dug around and I found the first freeway plan for the LA region, developed in 1943. Its opening line was a line of urgency. We must not wait, we must do this now. The time is now. And to Harriet's point, is urgency harms and continues to harm, particularly communities that are left out of the conversation. So what are patterns or signs that something is not innovative? If a particular solution or strategy or policy continues to displace people, then it's not innovative. If a strategy, if a solution continues to not distribute the benefits in an equitable manner and continues to harm and traumatize the same communities, either locally or on the global scale, then it's not innovative. If it continues to impact the health and safety of community members, it's not innovative. Whether it be on the global scale with lithium extraction, or whether it be on the local scale in terms of people not being able to remain in place because there was investment without protection. If the use of violence and criminalization is necessary in order to move your idea forward, it's not innovative. And lastly, if there is a lack of authentic, genuine community engagement that is not a replication of tokenization where you just have the meeting because you're required to have it, but you're willing to bend and maybe change your ideas in terms of what is innovative and what needs to move forward. If that doesn't happen, it's not innovative. What it is, it's repeating the same old tired patterns of urgency, which will inevitably benefit those who have always benefited and leave out a whole bunch of people, and particularly I want to name Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and those who don't come from generational wealth. I don't want to live in that future because it's unbearable to live in today. So I want us to challenge our notion of innovation and not have a false debate that's inevitably going to lead to false solutions about either or. Yes, we need all of that, and we need a lot more. Looking forward to hearing what others have to say and continuing the conversation with you all.
Great. Okay, Erika, you got a challenge before you. Tell us a little bit about your work in this space and how do you see this?
Sure. My name is Erika Myers, and I'm the Executive Director of North America for CharIN, which is the Charging Interface Initiative. We work on standards related to the EV charger and the car, and making sure that we have one global standard is our ultimate goal for what we do. My previous role, however, was at the World Resources Institute as the Global E-Mobility Director, and that job gave me a really good crash course in transportation and urban planning. My background being in energy, and specifically clean energy and alternative transportation fuels, I'd never been really exposed to that world. And so I realized there's this communication gap in the large part between the work that Harriet and Monique were outlining in local community-based transportation and urban planning and advocacy and sustainable mobility, and the work that I'd been doing in EV and energy. And what I realized is that we speak two different languages. We're talking to two different groups of audiences, regulators and policymakers, and we haven't had the opportunity really between our two communities to really collide in constructive ways that lead to partnerships and alignment. And I'm hoping that this conversation starts that dialogue today, and in your mind, maybe thinking about reaching out to advocacy groups like Harriet's with NUMO or like Monique's that will start to facilitate some of these really constructive and honest conversations around what we might be doing without knowing what we might be doing to these communities because we're just not aware. So I'm curious just if the community here understands a couple of really key terms. So raise your hand if you know what ASI frameworks are. Nobody. Who here knows what TDM means? Okay, a few more. Who here knows what an MPO is? Okay, a few folks. Who here knows what BRT means? Okay, good. So ASI is the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework. It is the foundation by which sustainable mobility operates. It's a very foundational term. It basically means you want to avoid any trips, you want to shift those trips to other modes, and you want to improve the trips that are taken through things like efficiency improvements and electrification. So definitely worth looking into that if you're not familiar. TDM, Transportation Demand Management, is again kind of the pivotal part of how do we transform transportation in communities. It's a lot about multimodal shifts and things like that. MPOs are metropolitan planning organizations. This is where transportation and urban planners largely operate and work with their local community governance agencies. For folks like us in the energy world, kind of the equivalent of a public utility commission. And then BRT is bus rapid transit. And that's, again, another way to get people moving more quickly throughout cities. These are all just a sample of the terms that you will come across if you start to investigate and explore exactly what transportation really is, and transportation planning. And for me, it was a totally different world that I thought I knew before I started this job, but then I realized quickly how unaware I was. And I think this is just a small example of when I say reaching across the aisle is really getting outside of your comfort zone and asking questions. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities here when we talk about pairing compact cities and EVs for us to really achieve our climate goals together, especially defined by the Paris Agreement, we get cost savings, we get air quality improvements, better quality of life for everybody. And in that future, obviously EVs are necessary alongside things like compact mixed-use cities that prioritize walking, biking, and public transit. They support each other, just like energy efficiency and renewable energy. So the one analogy that I like to talk about is that for the folks here who've worked in energy efficiency, we always say the cheapest kilowatt hour is the one that you don't produce. Just like that, the cheapest thing that we can do to prevent GHG emissions in the transportation sector is to eliminate a vehicle mile traveled. And the one that you can avoid is the best overall for the environment. And similarly, the way we have to think about EV is that yes, we want people to buy electric vehicles, absolutely, but we also want them to think about things like walking or e-bikes or e-scooters and seeing how can we support them in finding these different modes that work best for themselves and their families. And that's something all of us have to think about. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I think I want to jump. I think we all have lots of examples of when these worlds have collided in unhelpful ways, but I'd love to focus on some happier stories. So examples of where these two worlds have been able to work together to make things happen or have coordinated well. And I'll go to whoever's most motivated to share an example first. There's got to be a couple, right?
Yeah, I can start. I'll just talk about things like low emission and zero emission zones. So when I was at the World Resources Institute, we'd done a lot of work in Beijing. As you know, Beijing is one of the worst air quality metrics in the world, and so WRI had been very involved in helping to support the local government in Beijing reduce air pollution. And one of those was by eliminating certain kinds of freight vehicles in certain zones within Beijing. That was in 2017, and that has really led to this groundswell of support for low and zero emission zones. And WRI has since grown that program into an equity-centered zero emission vehicle delivery zone program. This is largely because we've seen a significant amount of trucking emissions between 2016 and 2019, 7.5% increase in GHG emissions, and those emissions are only expected to rise into the future as we become more and more dependent on e-commerce. And so WRI's aim was to target communities specifically in disadvantaged and environmental justice communities to help prevent the freight emission vehicle traffic that we know causes significant amount of air quality issues for these communities. And so what we're hoping to do with that work is to support initiatives like what C40 is doing with the Green and Healthy Streets Declaration, where 35 cities have committed to establishing zero-emission zones, at least one by 2030 in each of these 35 cities, and we're hoping it grows beyond that, and that cities can experiment with opportunities to support all types of alternatives, not just electric vehicles, but supporting communities in the growth of walking, biking, mass transit, ideally powered by electric, to reduce this air pollution burden in these communities. And I think this is a really great example of something that we could all be advocating for here in the US. And there are, unfortunately, some regulatory issues as it relates to state commerce that have prevented a lot of ZEV zones here in the US, but maybe we could start with things like curbside parking restrictions for zero-emission vehicle trucks and delivery vans and things like that that help to encourage and provide a market signal to the folks that operate in those cities. And that's just one example.
Yeah, Monique, do you have some examples?
Yeah, I want to share one example. It's actually a project that I'm currently working on in southeastern San Diego. We're doing this project in partnership with Grid Alternatives and also the Green Lining Institute as well. Are anyone from those organizations here? I can't see because I'm blinded by the light. They're here, yay. All right, great. We're doing this, we're doing what we're calling a community-driven mobility roadmap. And the start of the project, the conversation was about, okay, well, what are people's vision for the future of electrification, of mobility? But we had to pause and really acknowledge that the day-to-day trauma that people are living in. We can't just go to a community and say, hey, what's your vision for the future of electrification? When quite literally the week before, at the school we're doing the engagement, there was a child who was struck by a car because there's inadequate, walking infrastructure near that school. That would be incredibly insensitive of me to engage in that conversation. And we were talking a little bit before this session about, whether it be electric vehicles or compact cities, that transition is going to require some time, right? At least 20 years, 20 plus years to fully transition to one of those or both of those, and hopefully more. That includes equity. So one of the things as a planner is I need to be sensitive to people's current experiences. And so we changed the scope and the direction of the project to engage people in a conversation of what's their current experience or getting around their neighborhood. How can that be made better today? And once we had that conversation, we could then begin visioning together about what the future of mobility can and should be for them. So you need to engage simultaneously in both immediate fixes to directly improve in a meaningful way the quality of life of community members. At the same time, you're doing visioning. What oftentimes happens is communities like the one that I'm engaging in, they're left out of the visioning conversation altogether. And then as policies and plans and investments start to move forward, it is without their input and consideration. And we completely undervalue the genius of community, particularly Black and Brown communities. They have been living sustainably, oftentimes not by choice. They have been troubleshooting to make a quality of life for themselves. And there is genius that exists. And so we need to value that genius as well and not leave them out of the visioning conversation, but include them in that. But ensure as we invite them into the visioning conversations to start to shape what those future policies and programs and investments are going to look like, we need to be incredibly sensitive and responsive because we are responsible in terms of our own positionality. How do we leverage our positionality in those spaces to be simultaneously addressing those needs as we are on that road towards transition? I'm going to turn it over to Harriet from here. Yeah.
Yeah, Harriet. And maybe not to put you on the spot, but it seemed to me from the opposite coast, like bipartisan infrastructure law might have some examples as we were working to get not just more money for electric vehicles, but a lot more money for transit and other kinds of solutions as well.
Yeah, I think that is a really great point, and we started this conference with a terrific panel yesterday that I think really demonstrated something that's happening and something that we're going to be collectively asked to do if we're going to access some of the money, the $1.2 trillion in the bipartisan infrastructure law. A lot of that's going to go out by formula, but there's going to be a lot of discretionary funding available. And I think that the administration is setting a good example by telling to us they want us to do more, not just decarbonize the transportation and energy sector, sectors, but to consider the distribution of benefits and harms, including past harms, in any new infrastructure investments, and to increase equity, strengthen communities and their economies. I think this whole of government approach that was really modeled here on this stage yesterday morning is very important to advancing racial equity and addressing the climate change crisis. And they've laid it out in executive orders. And I think that language did not necessarily make its way into the bill itself in many cases, but we can see them putting equity and climate performance language in their notices of funding availability. So they're basically saying, we want you to do things differently. We want you to come together differently. And so even though every jurisdiction I've ever worked for had not just a 5-year or a 6-year capital plan, they had a 10 or 20-year wish list of capital projects that they wanted to fund. That, this administration is telling us not to take that list, dust off those old things, dress them up in the new language, and send them in. They really want us to sit down with communities that have been neglected, that have been overlooked, that have been harmed, and basically say, let's build a project together. Let's build an approach together. Let's even start with a plan together. Let's do this thing together. And, that has not been our practice, across the country at any level of government. So we're all going to be learning to do something differently. So, my organization, I'll just say, is part of an alliance that over the last 8 months we've worked to grow and build more than 70 different organizations so far, and I plan to talk to Jeff about fourth maybe joining us. It's called the Communities First Infrastructure Alliance, and we're trying to position ourselves with BIPOC-led, equity-centered organizations to kind of stand in between the federal funding and teams of local, state governments, transit agencies, MPOs, and communities to help bring them together and imagine a common set of goals and aspirations that they want to achieve together. And it's never going to be as narrow as electrify this or transit that. It's going to address these other things that are also going to be happening in a community when you make an investment, that might cause property values to rise, that might affect the ability of the very people you've targeted to help. It might affect their ability to even stay in those communities. So that's not an unexpected outcome at this point. That's utterly predictable. So who are the other partners we need to bring into the fold? Where, is there a community land trust that we can engage? Are there folks who are doing affordable housing that we can engage? Can we talk to small businesses and employers? Can we bring this team together to really talk about how can everything get better if we make this investment together? And how do we even set up the structures so that it's not just about getting the grant from the federal government, it's about implementing and achieving, these ambitious goals for the community. And that really means a very different kind of power arrangement. It might call for new institutions, at the state or local level, but I think that's the kind of thing that we're going to need to actually get different outcomes. What did Einstein famously say? The definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and expect a different result. Well, you're a pretty smart group of people, no insanity that I can see. We're going to have to do it differently.
Yeah, the insanity is hidden, I think. We were talking about this a little bit before, too, that one of the interesting things about this conversation is that the folks who are working on bikes and pedestrians and transit and compact urban form have a few decades head start on us. And we've certainly, I would say from an equity perspective, none of us claim to have it figured out. And we've seen, actually, if you wander just a little bit north of here, there's a great example of a bike project that proved that bike projects can be just as destructive to neighborhoods as roads can. But that was a couple of decades ago, and we've learned from that, and it's changed the way. And also from a process. So I guess what I'm heading for is, what can we learn from y'all who've been dealing with some similar issues, like how do we engage community, how do we center equity, how do we change the culture is another great example. I know a lot of my friends have spent decades trying to convince our state DOT, other state DOTs, to take bikes and pedestrians and transit as seriously as they take roads, and that's an ongoing struggle. Now many of us are trying to convince state DOTs and local DOTs to take electrification seriously. So what can we learn from you all in the next 5 minutes or so?
To change the culture, we need to change the epistemologies or our knowledge base, I believe. Going back to the impactful statement that Harriet made in the beginning about urgency, what would be the opposite epistemological framework? I would say it would be from the Iroquois around the 7 generations principle. Imagine if you as a planner, you as an engineer, you as a business professional operated within the 7 generations principles, and you made decisions based upon doing a full and complete and comprehensive and inclusive analysis of what that impact of that decision was going to be for all living beings, including plant and animal life, from now and 7 generations out. What would those solutions and strategies look like? The other thing that I think about quite often, as someone who exists in contradictory worlds, as someone who strives for social justice, but is not always able to operate because of certain structures and systems that exist, I often think about something that the movement generation based out of Oakland talks about, where they say transition is inevitable, but justice is not. So if we are to move towards a just transition, we have to make a lot of intentional decisions, but we also have to live in the contradictions. The contradictions of that we may not get all that we want immediately or all that we need immediately, but we must ask the question, as we move towards hopefully not just a transition, but a just one, and as we live in the contradictions, who are the contradictions going to harm disproportionately? Are they going to harm and continue to harm in terms of health, in terms of safety, in terms of housing, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and folks who don't come from generational wealth, or even just thinking about the global poor? Or are they going to uplift those communities and center those communities as well? So as we think about how do we move forward, we kind of have to deconstruct the foundation in which we understand the world today and look towards things like traditional ecological knowledge to reconstruct that foundation. And not just look towards those things and extract that knowledge, because that would be you operating in the same framework, but actually bring in intentionally Indigenous communities to the conversation as well, and having them be leaders in the conversation as well. I know I'm speaking really, really big picture, and so that's why I'm glad Erika and Harriet are here to kind of help round off this conversation.
So I wanted to quickly talk about the word urgency. So for many of us, we've been working in the EV space for a long time. I've been working in it since 2007. I know a lot of you out here have been working in this space for even longer. And it feels like it's taken forever to get to this point. And for us, that we've been wanting this momentum that we've been building towards for a really, really long time. It finally feels like we're here. and we're still only 2.5% penetration of electric vehicles right now in our communities, and there's a long road ahead of us. And so just to push back a little bit, it like urgency for us has been like it just feels like a very different paradigm, right? And we have a lot of work to do. One thing that I think about that needs to urgently happen is that we have got to think about how do we marry EVs with renewable energy generation. This isn't a thing that's really been worked out yet. How do we do that? And that's a solution that needs to happen really, really quickly if we want to realize the goals of electrification, which is decarbonization. We don't want to end up with a dirtier grid than the one we started with because of the impact of EVs on our grid systems. So that is, when we talk about urgency, I think we need to kind of frame it a little bit more and like what we mean by that. And for many of us, we're putting long hours into making sure that this whole industry even just becomes an industry. And so I'll just stop there. I just wanted to point that out as like something that I've reflected on for the last 2 days.
So, Erika, I will call your urgency and I will add equity. Mm-hmm. So if we all define our problem, whatever it is that we're trying to solve, a little bit wider, so that it's not just the outcome of decarbonization, but the outcome of a more equitable society, a more inclusive society, then I would be all in with you on urgency. I would feel that urgency. But I think part of it is that we're defining our problem too narrowly. And one of the things that I've really learned is that no matter how I slice it or dice it, no matter how messy it makes it, it turns out it is my job, to think about what's the impact of the policies I'm advocating? What's the impact of the investments I'm trying to make? It's not someone else's job. It's particularly not someone else's job that's on the receiving end of a really negative result. It's not their job to let me know that I screwed up or that that this isn't fair. It's my job to know this. So, we live in a time of a lot of change and a lot of conflict. And for me, whether it's it's not easier to work this way, but at some level, it's so much more deeply satisfying, that every day we're trying to do something that, yes, might protect the planet from catastrophic global warming, but we're also doing things that actually make people's lives better every day. That's what we're trying to achieve. And that is walking and chewing gum, and I know we can do it. And I just challenge, we have some public sector people in here who know that this is kind of their job, but we also have a ton of NGOs and private sector people who might feel like it isn't their job. I'm here to tell you, to ask you to think about making it your job, because everything we do could land a little differently if we thought about it, and if we included some different folks in figuring out what our approach should be. And it's not that hard to do, and people are surprisingly forgiving and gracious when you do it wrong, as long as you're clear that this is what you're trying to do, this is your intention, and you need their help to do it.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm wondering if we could bring it down and leave folks with just we have a pretty diverse audience, so this is going to be tricky. But if you had one piece of advice and one takeaway you want people to leave the room with, if there's one thing they want to go back to their I was going to say back to their office, back to their living room or wherever their computer is set up, and do one thing differently next week. Any thoughts?
I would just maybe reiterate, ask yourself, whatever you're working on, how can I make this land more equitably, right? And who do I need to talk to understand how that could actually be effectuated? Who do I need my partner to be to make that happen? Because honestly, it may not be, the right thing for you in your private sector job, but there's someone out there who would gladly work with you to help make that happen. So that's what I would say.
I would say walk in humbleness. We don't have all the answers. And so we need to ask the folks who are going to be potentially most impacted by the decisions to collectively come up with the answers together.
I would suggest when we're thinking about partnerships, what does that mean exactly? Business partners, community partners, local government partners. When you guys are all probably thinking about applying for NEVI funds, when you're thinking about how you're going to deploy that infrastructure in these communities, think differently about who you are going to include in that grant application, in that project development. Is there something that you can do to help support financially communities that are lived and based in these locations? And I just start with what you can do within your own sphere, and then maybe we could start a movement.
So I heard three, we'll see, moderator prerogative here. I heard three big takeaways for me. One is, this is an even bigger problem than we thought it was, or opportunity, right? It's not about electrification or compact cities. You can't separate transportation from housing. You can't separate transportation from generational wealth, because that's why people of color don't have generational wealth in a lot of cases, is because of our history of redlining. So it's much bigger. It's not just how do you integrate EVs into the grid and how do you decarbonize, it's how do you build a more just society, which just speaks to, I would say for me, why we love this event, because we're constantly bringing in, oh, now we need the housing people to be here, now we need the community-based organizations to be here, now we need, so that's first takeaway. The second is related, embrace the messiness. I love that quote. We have urgency and we need to slow down and engage. And those of you who were in our workshop on the team equity community practice yesterday probably heard that. We've spent a year or two getting to know each other, building relationships, building trust, and constantly having people on the door banging, saying, when are you going to launch a policy campaign? And we need to do both. Or as Rev Yearwood said, we need to train and fight somehow. And then the third is we have a ton to learn from each other. I hope this is the first of a lot of conversations to come, and that when you go back to your state, I would put a finer point on it and say, find somebody, if you're working on electrification, find somebody who's working on bikes and transit and better land use planning, and go have a cup of coffee, or if you're in Portland, go have a beer, and see what you have to learn from each other. So with that, can we thank our panelists? All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Jeanette.
Great. Why don't we give our panelists one last round of applause? That was excellent discussion. And I'm going to try not to feel the urgency to run out and have a great time with all these sessions today. I'll walk a little more slowly. But with that, my name is Jeanette Shaw. Thank you so much for a great discussion and again being here today. I'm the Director of Policy at Forth. We're going to take a break now, and that way you can all refill your coffee. You can check out the exhibits. Archimoto is also still doing their ride and drive, so please check that out. There's going to be 2 mini sessions happening upstairs at 10:05. The morning breakout sessions will start at 10:45, and we'll see you back on the main stage here for the closing keynote, which will feature Forth's Executive Director, Jeff Allen, who you just heard from. And this afternoon will be followed by an after party at the Forth office with a live DJ, lots of great networking and fun, so be sure to stick around for that fun. So again, refill your coffees and have a great day. Thank you.